the Beebe Middle School. And we also want to thank Maya Cohen and Malden Access Television, as well as Malden Reads volunteers who have come, as well as Mary Leigh Bears, who's the librarian here at the high school, and the ELA department chair, and everybody who's been involved to make sure that we can bring you a great talk this morning from Brendan Kiely, who wrote this book here, All American Boys. You may have started it, you may have finished it. If you started it, we may have some spoilers for you, but it's still a great book. And we can see here, this is, some of you who have started it may remember an issue in the book that happened in the variety store. Well, this is the Oak Grove Variety Store, and we just surprised Brendan Kiely with this picture. This is something we were thinking of and he had in mind as he was writing the book. Because he is actually from our neighboring town of Melrose. So with that...
Which was Malden years ago.
I was going to say, don't hold it against me.
All right, so
All
with
right.
that, take it away.
Thank you
Brendan.
very much. I appreciate that, Jody. This is, I have to say, this really is pretty cool that I get to come and speak with you all, because it really is like, this is the spot that I was thinking about when I was sitting down to work on this book. So it's pretty, I have like goosebumps right now. It feels a little weird, but it's also super exciting. And I also want to say, I really wish that Jason Reynolds, co-author of the book, could be here with me, but unfortunately he can't be. He and I can't be in the same place all the time. He's speaking somewhere else today. Sometimes we get to speak together, sometimes we don't. I wish he was here, because whenever we're doing it together, that's obviously best, because that's the point of the book, is for the two of us to have co-written this book together. So before I talk too much more, I just want to get a little bit of input from all of you. And don't worry, be honest, it doesn't matter. But have a few of you started reading the book? I just need a little show of hands here. Okay, so let me do this then. So for all those who haven't yet, let me explain the concept of this book and why we're all sitting here. And then I'm going to tell you a couple of stories about myself to give you a sense of why I wanted to participate in this project. So All American Boys is the story of two boys, one black, one white, both of whom go to the same high school, live in the same town, are going to the same Friday night party. They stop at the same corner store on the way to that party, and when they go to that corner store, Rashad Butler, who's the young black boy, is brutalized by a police officer when he's mistaken as a thief. And Quinn Collins, the young white boy, witnesses this all happen, and more to the point, he knows the police officer. The police officer is a father figure for him, because his own father died in the war in Afghanistan. Why would we write this book? Jason and I became friends in 2014. He was touring the country for his first novel called When I Was the Greatest. And if you have not read that book, you should read that book, because it's spectacular. And I was touring my first book, The Gospel of Winter. And we were published by the same publishing company, and they put us on tour together. And so Jason and I were traveling the country together. Traveling the country, we were going all over. And while we were traveling, we were watching what seemed like one news story after another, one really big news story after another, of police brutality, young folks of color who were brutalized or even killed by police officers. And as we were traveling the country, it was impossible for us not to talk about this. In fact, just before we went on tour, it was shortly after the Trayvon Martin verdict. Everyone remember Trayvon Martin? Yeah. Shot and killed by George Zimmerman in Florida because of their bonkers law, Stand Your Ground, which I am happy to be on tape saying that should not be a law. It's ridiculous because of what the results are. Jason's mother, Jason's a black woman from South Carolina, has emotional and physical scars from racism in America, calls up her son Jason before he's going on tour to say, I am worried for you. I'm worried for your safety. I'm worried for your life. I'm nervous. You're traveling the country. And he's like, don't worry. I'm traveling the country with this other guy. She's like, who? This guy, Brendan. He seems nice. Who's Brendan? He's a white guy. Oh, yeah? He's from Boston.
Oh, no.
There's a reason why people call Boston up south. So I think it's important to put that all in context, right? I'm not going to like sugarcoat this, right? I think it's important to put this in context because as we're going out on to tour the country, my mother didn't call me, right? She didn't call me. She wasn't worried about my safety in the same way. And so Jason and I had to begin to talk about this. And one day, there was an incident at a book festival, and there were these menus that were passed out at this restaurant. There were 18 authors at this restaurant, and the menus were. This was in Texas. The menus were incredibly racist. The way they sort of spelled out all the dishes on the menu, it was as if somebody with a Latino accent was speaking English with that accent, and it was all spelled out phonetically. And there were caricatures all over the menus, and it was disgusting. And there were a lot of people there, and nobody wanted to talk about it. And so I pulled Jason aside, and I said, "Listen, I know this is bonkers, but like later when we get back to the hotel, if you just want to yell and scream, I'll just sit there and be quiet, and I'll listen." And he said, "Really?" And we did that. And the reason why I'm sharing that with you is because I think it's really important to put this in context. I'm not patting myself on the back for anything. It's a context of how Jason and I could begin to form a more authentic friendship. And if Jason were here, he would tell you that I did. I sat and I listened to him. I didn't try to fix him. I didn't try to say I understand in the same way, because I can't. I didn't try to say, well, statistically, there's this and that. I didn't try to make excuses. I just sat there and listened to him while he began to tell me lots of stories. And again, back to what I was saying before, this is at a time when we were watching all these news stories, right? This is at a time just after George Zimmerman was acquitted for the murder of Trayvon Martin. And so Jason began to tell me some stories about his own youth and what it was like growing up as a young black man in Washington, D.C., and some of the interactions that he had with police. And as we were talking, we were thinking about how different our two lives were growing up. We were thinking about, there's a famous speech that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave 60 years ago, shortly before he was assassinated. He gave this speech at Grosse Pointe High School in 1968, and he spoke about two Americas living side by side. And Jason and I began thinking about that, how true that still felt today. These two American experiences that we were living concurrently. I'm a little older than him. He likes to point that out. But basically, we live very different lives, and we want to talk about that. We kept talking about this until August of 2014, when Michael Brown was shot and killed in Ferguson, Missouri. We all remember Michael Brown? And as that moment was happening, Jason and I decided, well, we need to do something. We want to respond. And in particular, we want to write something that is for young folks who can begin to process this. If we can get this into classrooms around America, right? We can get folks talking about some of this in those classrooms. And sometimes it's harder to talk about what's going on in our own lives. So instead we can talk about Rashad Butler and Quinn Collins and what's going on in the book, as opposed to having to talk about what's going on in our own lives. But this meant, why do we want to do this? Because Jason and I were talking about what happened when we were both growing up. And I'm going to share with you this one story of my own that was going through my mind as I was writing Quinn Collins' half of the book. Because Jason, when he sat down to write Rashad's half of the book, this is what he thought about. He thought about how he watched his cousin get slammed on the hood of a police car when he was, not even 13 years old. He thought about the time he watched another cousin get his teeth kicked in. He thought about the time that he himself had been pulled over by the police and they ransacked the car looking for drugs and guns and things like this. And he has all these stories to share. And if he were here, he would tell you some of those stories. And I thought back to my own experiences. What the heck is a white dude doing talking about all this? What do I have to say? What's my role to play in this conversation? I can't pretend that I had Jason's same experiences, right? But that's still part of the story. And this is why I want to share this story with you. Because I think if we're going to be honest, we have to be honest about all of it. And so, I think back to Brendan Kiely. This is really surreal because I also used to deliver the Globe. And when I was delivering the Globe, I had to go right around the corner. The processing center was over by Malden Catholic. And so it was like, this is like familiar territory for me. I got my license in Lynn. And I still can't believe I actually got my license. I probably shouldn't have, because I think my mother was just flirting with the cop. And that's how it all came together. But anyway, that note aside, I got my license somehow. And and I was the last of all my friends to get my license. And so finally, one night, it's my turn to drive. And I'm like, oh yes, I'm so excited. I get to take the guys out, right? And I was that wicked cool guy who got to share the minivan with his mom. But I didn't care, because it was my turn to drive. So finally, I'm driving, and I'm driving on Route 1. I'm driving on Route 1 heading south, back towards Saugus, where I was going to drop somebody off. And there's a speed trap in Linfield on Route 1 where the speed limit reduces quickly. I was driving 85 miles an hour. Don't do this. I'm not bragging. I'm just telling you the truth. Don't do this. Don't do this. I was driving 85 miles an hour, and at that point, it's a 55-mile zone. So I'm going 30 miles over the speed limit. So how many of you have your license? Does anybody have their license yet? A few of you. Right, so you know, right? If I'm going 30 miles over the speed limit, not only am I speeding, it's also reckless driving. So I'm breaking the law in two ways. And I'm not proud of this moment, but I'm sharing it because I have to get to the point of honesty, of why I have half of this story to tell, of why there are two Americas, and we've got to talk not only about an America that is being abused, but also about another America. And this is what happened. I'm going 85 in the 55. The police car pulls up behind me. If Jason were here, as probably many of you in this room know, starting from when he was 10 years old, his mother gave him a talk. She gave him a specific talk about what to do when you're interacting with a police officer. Not if, but when. That sense of inevitability, right? And if Jason were here, he would tell you that talk. He had it memorized. It was drilled into his head about what to do. Now, when I was growing up, and how I grew up, I never had a talk. Nobody ever gave me a talk about what to do when the police come or if the police come. Right? In fact, the assumption in my mind, talk about two Americas here, the assumption in my mind is that the police are there to protect society from crazy people like me who are breaking the law and endangering lives, right? That's the assumption. So the police car pulls up behind me, what do? Now, if Jason were here, again, he would share with you all that to this day, a grown man, he still has a trembling fear inside when he gets pulled over by the police. He was pulled over by the police just a couple of months ago with his older brother. And the first thought through his mind was of sheer terror. I'd never had that terror before. And I think it's important to talk about this, right? I never had that terror. Yes, I was nervous. It's a police car, of course. But I wasn't terrified in the same way, especially not then. That police car pulls up behind. So what do? I'm nervous, never done this before. I floor it! I keep tearing down the highway. This is ridiculous, right? First of all, it's a minivan from a long time ago, because I'm like old as dirt. And so minivans like barely went 85. So the needle's like bouncing like this. The minivan's like, my friends are like, Brendan, pull over, pull over. I don't know where it's safe to pull over, right? I'm tearing down the highway. This is ridiculous, right? Up ahead, I think they finally tore this thing down, but the Ship, that restaurant, the Ship on Route 1, is it torn down now? It's torn down. Good, because the food was terrible. Anyway, the Ship, this giant red ship on the side of the highway. I see that ship. I pull into the parking lot. I pull into a parking space. This is ridiculous. This is really ridiculous, right? Police officer comes over, asks for license registration. I'm not even kidding you. I gave him my license, and I'm so dumb. I thought the writing on the back of my license was my registration. I had no idea. Who gave me my license? This is ridiculous, right? Luckily, my friend Adam, who's smarter than me and was always smarter than me and will always be smarter than me, knew that the registration was in the glove compartment, pulls it out, gives it to me, I give it to the officer. Officer goes back to the car, does some business, comes back and says, get out of the car. I get out of the car. He says, have you been drinking alcohol tonight? No, not at all. have you been smoking marijuana tonight? No, not at all. Why the hell are you going 30 miles over the speed limit, he yells. And I go into a sob story. Because I can. Oh, Mr. Officer, we're just trying to play mini golf up the way and it wasn't working out. We're supposed to go get ice cream and I just want to go home. I just want to go home. Ridiculous, right? It's ridiculous. But why do I tell you this stupid story? Because you know what happens next. Did I get a ticket? No. Not at all. Did I get a written warning? No. Not at all. But that's not why I tell you the story. I tell you the story for what happens next. I tell you the story because this is what is going through my mind as I sit down to write Quinn Collins' half of All American Boys. This is what's going through my mind as I think about part of why there is injustice in this country. Part of why, when we think about there being two Americas living side by side, it's not as if injustice just comes out of nowhere. It's that if there is a system that is built that disenfranchises some people, it's built to give power and privilege to others. And if we're going to think about that, we've got to be honest about that. And so as I think about that moment with this police officer, I am so sure that this police officer took some pity on me. My knees are knocking, gonna make a little puddle between my sneakers, I'm sure he took some pity on me. But if I stop there, I am participating in the lie that I was taught from when I was a child. The lie that I, Brendan Kiely, am an individual first and foremost. That I, Brendan Kiely, don't represent something larger. Because I do. I'm part of a larger collective. And I'm never taught, at least when I was growing up, never taught to think about what that means. Remember, nobody ever said to me, Brendan, this is what it means to be a white boy growing up in America. Because the answer to that, if they're going to really start talking about it, makes a lot of white folks uncomfortable. This is true, right? Because what the police officer said to me next, and every time I have to say this, and I traveled the country, I've talked to more than 50,000 students around the country, I've talked in colleges, I've talked in jails, I've talked in high schools and middle schools, right? And every single time I have to say this, it's like a little fish hook in my gut that just tugs and tugs and tugs to remind me what it means to have white privilege in America. He said, go home, be safe, and keep your friends safe. And I think about that line. That police officer, when he was looking at me, he said, you kid, you get a break. You deserve a break. I have this pity for you. I see you as this little kid who's trembling, whose knees are knocking, and you get a pass this time. I know you didn't mean to do bad. These are all the things that are going through it's the subtext of what he's telling me when he says, go home, be safe, keep your friends safe. Think about this for a second. Think about how Tamir Rice, who was 12 years old, didn't get that break. That's part of the difference. And it's part of the injustice, and I'm actually a part of the injustice. Especially if I'm not reflecting on why I'm given that privilege, right? For me, I think it's important for us to be honest about this. And again, this is why we have a book like this, so we can have these conversations in our communities. When I look back on this moment, right, and I think about how when I was your age, white folks like me had a really hard time talking about race and racism. We didn't want to talk about it. It made us feel really uncomfortable on the inside, squeamish in so many ways. But if I'm spending all of my energy protecting that comfort, there's never going to be a time when I can talk about safety and justice and equity for everyone, because I'm spending all my energy protecting my comfort. That's not right. That's part of the injustice. So that's what we've got to expose, right? We've got to expose that out there. Otherwise, we can never get to the real conversation that we need to have. Meanwhile, on the other half of the story, here's Jason talking about what it means to go through this kind of psychology of terror, but at the same time, go through that psychology with your family, with your church groups, with your school community, and what it means to then build a sense of confidence and pride and identity out of that. Because that's also part of the injustice. If we only talk about the horror, if we only talk about the brutality, then that's just limiting the story. When Jason and I sat down to write this book, Jason's first instinct was, we are not going to tell a story where the black kid dies. He said, that is part of the injustice. That's not the only story. How about we live, is Jason saying, speaking from his own perspective. How about, yes, we get brutalized, but we survive. We're stronger than that. Jason's point of this story is pride. And so as I'm telling half the story and talking about reflecting on injustice and my own role in injustice, right? Jason's half of the story is, well, guess what? We're better than that. It's all about pride. I think that's important. That's how we're trying to talk about getting these two stories together. That's why we would write this book together. Because no one else was doing that. When we sat down to work on this book, we knew that there were going to be other books out there that tackled similar subject matter. But there weren't any books where there was a black man and a white man writing a book together. And that's what we thought would make this book a little more special. And again, I'm going to end this, and then I'm going to turn this out. I'm going to open this up into Q&A, because I talked a lot. And I was a teacher in New York City for 10 years, and I would never talk this much in class, because it's like, who wants to hear a teacher talk that much? But I will finish with this before I open this up for some questions. The idea that this uncomfortability and this sense of safety and justice, and we got to bridge these gaps, I think that they happen by having really meaningful, authentic conversations. But what I mean by that is back to where I started this whole story, is how did Jason and I become friends? I think the United States of America, at large, could learn from how Jason and I formed a more authentic relationship. Because it works like this. I think white folks, truthfully, need to do a better job listening to the truth coming from communities of color across this country. We've been speaking the truth forever. And it's up to us to do a better job, I think, listening. And I mean that on a big systemic level. I mean that in communities. I mean that in hospitals. I mean that in education systems. I mean that in law enforcement. I mean that across the country, right? We can be better listeners. And the only other thing I'm going to add to that, if you're interested in this kind of social justice literature, if you're interested in the kind of conversations about really being honest and not shying away from tough topics, all the things that I've just said about race in America and about white folks and our privilege, well, all us guys in this room got to think a lot about our male privilege too, especially in times like today. And so, plug, but my next book called Tradition is actually all about that. So if you're interested in these kinds of real conversations about roots of injustice, about how injustice affects our communities, and you're serious about the conversation about race, I think we should also be serious about the conversation about gender. Because we guys get away with too much. I played basketball my whole life growing up. I was in those locker rooms. I remember that kind of talk. I remember how those jokes went around. And I think about how those jokes, later, you hear somebody running for president making those same comments. And he excuses his violent attitude, behavior, and language towards women by calling it locker room talk. Well, if we make the jokes okay there, we're saying it's okay in the broader society. And guys, we got to do better. We can be better listeners too. So, I'll leave you with that, because now you're like, oh my God, why did this serious guy come? He's like bumming us out. But, come on, it's okay to have serious conversation. And I think that literature provides us a way into having these conversations. Because again, we can talk about Rashad Butler and we can talk about Quinn Collins, and we don't have to talk about ourselves first and foremost. I talked a lot. Probably too much. Everyone's like, whoa. But, do you have questions for me? Because I have way more stories. I can tell you all kinds of stories. I can story tell all day long. I'm Irish, so gift or curse. But I'm curious to hear from you all a little bit about this, because I think it's really exciting, and I'm super grateful that you would choose a book like All American Boys to have this kind of community conversation, to have a conversation in schools. It's thrilling to me. Jason and I have had the great fortune to have this book in spaces. It was the One Maryland One book, so we toured Maryland for an entire week, and different communities were talking about it. It was the Baltimore City all-city read, so the whole city was reading the book, probably not the whole city, but supposedly many folks were reading the book. It was exciting, right? We were in Rochester, New York, where my cousin is a police officer, right? And we had this conversation with police officers, and police officers were sitting across the table from young folks who had had many interactions with the police, right? And there was a cross dialogue so that the students could say, hey, this is why we're so afraid of you. And the police officers could say, guess what? We're afraid of you. And then we could all say to each other, why is everyone so afraid? Let's have a conversation about this. I think literature can help those conversations. So that's why I'm incredibly grateful for the folks who would provide that for you all here. All right. That was like my fourth epilogue. How about some questions? Yeah.
So,
Nice
what was the inspiration behind Quinn's character, making him come from like an army family, having him play basketball, anything like that? What drove you to write him?
Great question. So, we set this book in, we call it Springfield. And the idea was, like The Simpsons, it could be Springfield, any state, USA, right? We actually, for the purpose of writing the book, we needed to know, like, where's the school, and where's the corner store, and where's the, where is everything? And we used the map of Springfield, Massachusetts, because the demographics for Springfield, Massachusetts are similar to Ferguson, Missouri. And by demographics, I mean the way that the community has shifted and changed pretty dramatically in a short period of time. The odd thing, and this is something I never get to talk about, but I can talk about here, is that we almost set it in Malden. Because it's familiar to me, but it wasn't as familiar to Jason. So that's why we ended up shifting it. But we almost set the book here in Malden. Because it's a similar kind of demographic change in a short period of time. Because that was in my mind when I was sitting down to think about this, and though the Quinn Collins character is similar to me in many ways, he's white, plays basketball, I had to take care of my younger brother all the time. My mother worked the night shift at Mass General Hospital in the cardiac intensive care unit for 43 years. That's the stuff that was very familiar to me. However, I'm, like I said, old as dirt, so I wasn't a teen at the same time. And as I was thinking about the kinds of pressures that a lot of young folks have today, these pressures include the fact that so many of their older siblings and parents are involved in the armed services after 9/11. And many of my younger brother's friends went into the armed services after 9/11, and many of those friends live here in Malden. And so for me, it felt like a reasonable thing to make this seem like it was reality. Also, this is what freaks me out to no end, that is anyone who's sitting here 19 years old or older? Right, so for your entire life, all of you who are sitting in chairs, for your entire life, our country has been at war. That freaks me out. And we've been at war in Afghanistan for your entire life. And for me, I feel like there's something kind of important for us to recognize in a metaphorical level, that our country's relationship with violence exists on the most macro political level and also in the most micro community levels, where that violence happens. The violence that we excuse as a community, we meaning some of us more than others in our communities, the violence that we excuse in our law enforcement and the violence we excuse in our macro level politics. And who loses? Regular folks. The soldiers out there, the people in the community who are brutalized by police officers, regular folks are the ones who get used and abused. So that was why I wanted to create that dynamic, that Quinn understands some of that. And I don't want to give away the end of the book. Have you read the end of the book?
Yes.
Because I think that's important, right? That he's thinking about what the spirit of why his father wanted to enlist, right? The spirit of what it means to want to be doing the right thing. Because I think about that when I think about law enforcement officers too. Many law enforcement officers, my cousin included, who's a police officer, get into the business because they want to do the right thing. They want to protect society. They want to serve, and they get into it with good intentions. But as I was just hearing on a conversation last night with some social justice folks talking about some incidents that have happened in Arlington nearby recently, it's one thing to have intention, it's another thing to recognize your impact. And so, despite the fact that my cousin, who's white like me, wants to do a good job as a police officer, he also has to recognize that when he goes into a certain community in Rochester, New York, the first thing that people are going to see is not his like good intentions. They don't see his invisible, I want to be Superman cape, right? They see something they fear. And we have to recognize that distinction. That's an awesome question that people rarely ask. So I'm really grateful for your insight on that. Thank you
for answering it.
Yeah, no problem. That's awesome. All right. What up? Now I'm fired up. So let's hit me with some questions. Whatever you have. Yeah.
Not to like spoil, obviously, but like, what made you end the book the way you did? Like, not choosing the negative route, but like, why couldn't you carry it on in a way?
I think it's a great question. I think I can answer it without spoiling too much. I think it's okay to say there isn't a court case, because that's not the arc of the book, right? And part of me feels like, is that part of what you're getting at?
Well, yeah, I know it's not about the court case, but I'm just saying, like,
Right.
I would like to, like, I would want to know what happened.
Right. So, okay, I don't know. I feel like everyone just cover your ears. No. The best way I can do this without trying to spoil the end, right? Because I think it's an important question, because we were very conscious about why we ended the way we ended. I think back to 2014, and I think back to the police officers involved in all of those high-profile cases, and I think back to how not a single one of them was held to account by the law. Not one. In all those high-profile cases. The only one that I can think of off the top of my head was a police officer in New York City who is an officer of color and who was held to account for a misfiring in a hallway in New York. That says something about our justice system and how messed up it is. It's really, the way that it operates is that there's no way to hold them to account. So we didn't want to end the story with that because of how negative that feels. Or we didn't want to twist that around and be like, and then the world was okay, because that's stupid. But what we can talk about is real, is I think where we end the book, which has to do with the community. And for us, this is, so we were stunned when we had this given to us as a cover. Because authors don't get to choose their covers, I mean, for the most part, unless you're like, you know, a huge superstar. So this arrived in our inboxes, and Jason and I had said to our editor, there's only one thing we don't want for a cover. If you just would please listen to us. We don't want photorealism. And then we got photorealism, and our first instinct was like, what? You know, like, that's the one thing we didn't want. But then they told us what it was. And then we were stunned, because this is an actual photograph taken from the streets of Ferguson, Missouri, in the first hands up, don't shoot protests. And that's perfect, because to end the book with a community that's standing up in those ways, I think makes the most sense. And it's the most realistic, positive, hopeful, though I use that word carefully, kind of way to end the book. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's, I mean, again, it goes back to what Jason said when we first sat down to work on the book. My first point was, I don't want this book to have a white savior. I think that narrative is destructive. I think it's part of the myth that keeps white folks ignorant of their own place in the system of injustice. And Jason's point was, we don't need to start this book with a young person of color dying. We need to start this book with a young person of color surviving. And we're going to end at a point then that talks about the value of that. That's a great question. And it's so weird how many like little things we think about when we're working on the book. I think often when I was a student, I was always like, the teacher's making that up. And the author was never thinking about that, you know? But now that I write books, I like remember some of those moments and I think, yeah, actually, we were really conscious about nearly everything in the book. There were a couple of surprises here and there, but we were very conscious. Thank you for that. What else? Yeah.
I noticed on the cover that the O is like a different color, and even on the other book cover.
Yeah.
Is there like a significance behind that?
So, okay, I used to get this question, and I used to lie and make up an answer because I didn't know. And I would say, so the beginning of the book, right? The very beginning of the book is a poem, and the very end of the book is a poem, and it's asking people to step through the camera into the life of the characters, right? Because we thought that's kind of a cool way to frame this, especially given how so many Americans who are on the outside are witnessing all of this now through news and social media and whatnot. Many Americans live this reality every day, but many other Americans are experiencing it in some way through social media and through the news stories. The idea on some level was to frame the book as to say, so for all of us who feel like this is not our reality, none of us can pretend anymore that we're not witness to this reality, because we've all seen it now. Everyone has seen it. You can't deny that it doesn't exist. So if we frame the book in that sense, we're asking every reader to step past the camera lens into the story and then step back out into their own life, the ending that we're asking them to think about, right? And in many ways, that was what I think has to do with this O and the idea of a camera lens. However, when I further pressed the designer, because I was like, look, Michael, we need to know, we got to know, because everyone is asking about this white O. And I hope you have a good answer and it's not a bad one. And he was like, well, it's all American boys, so I wanted the cover to have red, white, and blue. And I was like, man, that bums me out. But that was his answer. I also think, though, that part of it is actually the framing that I mentioned before. Because all designers, I know from my work with designers on other books, is that they use references from the book and imagery from the book in the cover. And I think the idea of choosing the O, I mean, they could have chosen any number of things, right? And that was part of the idea. So that's a great question. That's like critical analysis of the imagery, which is awesome. It's so cool.
What was it like collaborating with another author? Like, were you guys fighting a lot, or did you have disagreements, or were you mostly on the same page?
Oh my gosh, yeah, this is a great question, because so every time when Jason and I get to present together, Jason always jumps at the chance to answer that question first, because he likes to make up a story about how we got into this big fight and he had to like knock me out, and I'm always like, I gotta be the guy who's knocked out every time? Well, yeah, but no, that never happened, because we didn't start writing the book until after we become friends, right? And so the number one rule for us, the number one rule before all those other things I was talking about before, was that the friendship comes first. The friendship always comes first.
Listening.
Exactly. No, it's absolutely. And that's true. That was true for the writing process. That's true now. He and I, like today, I'm going to text him to say, hey, I was having this conversation. He'll text me later to say where he was in the conversation he was having. We're always checking in with each other. At night, if we do a presentation together, we sit down at dinner and we check in with each other. Because even though we were in the same room, we're going to experience it differently. And so we try to do that. So when we sat down to write the book, there was so much trust built up that I make the analogy to basketball. Because I played way too much basketball. But it felt like we're running down the court together in a fast break, and I don't even have to look, and I know where he's going to be. Right? I can pass the ball, and he's going to be there. And likewise for him. So the way that works out in the writing, we sat down to work on the first chapter, and we worked on some of that together. We had to make sure that things lined up, right? So my first version of the chapter, it happened late at night. His first version of the chapter, it happened at 3 p.m. So we had to correct that. Little things like that we corrected. And then Jason wrote 5 chapters on his own, and I wrote 5 chapters on my own. And then we brought them back together. and we had allowed each other to have our own creative freedom and our own voice to develop for the story, and we trusted each other. And what's unbelievable is that some of the metaphors just magically matched up. I had no idea he was going to write about Aaron Douglas, and he had no idea that I was going to write about Ralph Ellison. Maybe somewhere in the back of our minds we had some inclination, because I know Jason is he's like super into art and graphic stuff, and he knows that I'm like a book nerd and was an English teacher, and I'll find a way to get a book reference in. But really beyond that, we had no idea. And so it was special. It was really special. So I love that question because it provides me the opportunity to remind folks that the book doesn't exist without the friendship. I love that man so much. And he's one of my closest confidants in my life, after my wife. Right? But that matters. When Jason no longer lives in New York City, so when he comes to New York City and he's not, getting put up in a fancy hotel and he's on Trevor Noah or something, he stays at our apartment. And my wife and I joke because we have a spare bedroom and we just call it Jason's room. And he gets clothes there. It's awesome. So there were no fights. What else? Yeah.
So like how you were talking about like how you guys wrote this book to help people that didn't see the picture quite clearly, help them wake up to the imagery. Has there been people that came to you telling them that book helped them realize instead of talking about it uncomfortably, it helped them open up more to the subject and more approach it with more respect. You get what I'm trying to say?
I do. I totally get what you're saying. And I feel very, very grateful that yes, there have been some folks, especially in the communities where they are doing specific programming. So in Waltham, Massachusetts, and in Wellesley, Massachusetts, they did programming where they had police officers come into the classrooms and study the book with students. And in some of those instances, police officers came up to us afterwards to say, thank you. And we were like, oh no, what's going to happen? But they said thank you because it enabled them to have a conversation that they previously weren't ready to have or didn't know they needed to have because they were on the defensive. And it's those kinds of moments that I feel like, that's unbelievable. And that's not just the book, that's the spectacular programming that teachers are doing to incorporate all that. But the book provided that springboard. There were my grandmother, who's a white lady in Rochester, New York. I'm so proud of her because there's a long family story, but at some point my father left home. He left home at 16, and so my grandmother would try to reach out to him once in a while, and my father, to be a jerk to her, would say, well, if you want to see me, you have to come join me at this Black Panther rally. And my grandmother would just go to be with him. But she wasn't processing what was going on at the Black Panther rally in the same way. All these years later, after reading All American Boys, she said to me, Brendan, I didn't realize how some of my everyday interactions are racist. And I thought to myself, wow, Grandma, you can come around and say that. And I think that matters. I think on the flip side, in communities that are predominantly folks of color, there have also been some instances where the book, I think, provides some sense of we don't need to have horror stories as our only reflection. And so there have been many thank yous to Jason in particular to say thank you for not having this book be about death. And that in that sense, there was a way to say our stories are much broader than some of the ones that we keep returning to. So it's worked both ways in that way. But again, I really appreciate your question because I think that it's not just the book, it's the people who embrace it and choose to use it for programming. Because programming is work. So it's a great question. Yeah. What else? Has this class started to read the book?
So this crew right here is our
5
lone
pages.
eighth grade crew.
5 pages, all right, good.
It just started. We're gonna do a weekly lunch book club.
Okay.
So they're reading this outside of their other
classes strictly voluntarily.
Good for you all. That's exciting.
Yeah, and so they'll give up their lunch once a week to sit with me and Miss Urga to
Nice.
read. So they just started this week. We just got it all together this week. So.
Okay. Well, cool. Well, you'll have more information now after you've heard the talk, too. One of the things, and this goes back to the point about programming, one of the things that I think is exciting about the book is that how we can use it to make references to, reality. So how we can read the book alongside various news stories or other articles. One of the articles that and it might be a little bit boring in some parts, but an article that I think is worth reading alongside this, if you can get through it, is the New Yorker profile of Darren Wilson, the police officer who shot and killed Michael Brown. Because, back to what I was saying before about how the gentleman's question over here about why did we choose to have Quinn's father be a soldier in the Army, I didn't even know this until Jason and I were in Ferguson and we were doing some events in the St. Louis area shortly after the book was published. There was a group there called Ferguson 360 that do a lot of advocacy work and community building, and they're creating a documentary about the community. And but I learned from them that the way that the police force is organized in the St. Louis metro area, they're organized. The history of organization for their various police stations and whatnot come from Civil War militias. And to think about what that means, how that's so deeply ingrained in our American history, and to think about how in the Darren Wilson article, he shares willingly that his former mentor, when he was working for a different municipality in St. Louis, had said to him, "Your first job is to get to know the people in the community. That's your first job." And that mentor took him around. They would hang out near the high school and not bust anybody's chops. They just hang out and get to know people by their names, so that when they saw them on the street, they saw a human being. Darren Wilson got shifted to Ferguson, and he said, "I didn't need that kind of training anymore. I had it. I know what I'm doing. I could just do my job." And it was shortly after that he shot and killed Michael Brown. And to think about how he dismissed the human beings, it's not disconnected from our history around us, the organization of those police units that go all the way back to the militias and the Civil War. This is American history, and I think it's important for us to read this book in concurrent with our studies of American history and how that history lives today in the present. And there's so many more. But I've had 2.5 years to think of connections, so that's a slight advantage. But I think that's one of the things that can be exciting about reading a book like this. And also, by the way, The Hate You Give, which is, I think, exciting to read as well, because it also has some of the same kind of questions to discuss. Though I wish there wasn't. I wish it didn't begin the way it begins. Anyway. What else? Other questions? Did you all just come in?
Yeah, they're with me. They all read the book.
Oh, you read the book?
Yeah.
Okay, good. But you missed the presentation. So what is this guy talking about?
They'll see it on video.
Yeah.
We promise.
For independent readings.
I know. I realize I should have angled more to the camera. It's going to get a lot of voiceover. But
Is that a head scratch key or is that a question? We were almost there.
sorry to call you out there, man.
When a few of us first got here, you were talking a little bit about the convenience store, but other folks hadn't come in at that point. I was wondering if you could just talk a minute or so about
Oh, sure.
about why that picture's up there.
Thanks. Yeah. So for those who don't know, I am from this area. I grew up in Melrose. Well, first Somerville and then Melrose, and I would cross the Melrose line when I was young and dumb, and try to hang outside convenience stores and see if somebody would help me out, find a beer, and don't do that. But I was so stunned to see this photograph because this store, somewhere in the back of my mind, this is the store by Oak Grove, but this is a store that I was basically thinking of to start this book. And when Jason and I were mapping out the book, because this is really how we did, sort of also address your question from before. Jason and I agreed we were going to write this book together. And so what we said was, okay, so we're going to have two narrators. So Jason's going to go figure out his narrator and that narrator's family. I'm going to go figure out my narrator and my narrator's family. And then we'll come back together and we'll introduce each other to these two families, and we'll see, are there any interesting things we can do to sort of create some more parallels? And so hence some of the conscious parallels at that point between what Rashad's father is saying, like there's, you got to be in uniform in one way or another, and then the kind of uniform that Quinn's father has and all this stuff. So we were trying to make some of those connections. But then we said, okay, so we got to figure out this first scene, and we got to figure out the corner store, we got to figure out how it all works out. And I was like, so this is what we used to do. And I told him the story of how we used to go to do this. And we would hang out around the side. So this photo is like haunting me right now. the stupidity of my youth, but also as the inspiration for the store that begins the book. Because, again, for those who may not have heard before, we were toying with where to set the story. And at one point, and part of that also, very, very truthfully, was that my wife, who's also a novelist, had received a Fulbright grant to move to Italy. And so I was teaching high school, but I didn't want to stay teaching high school when my wife was going to live the good life in Italy. So I quit and was going to move to Italy with her. But Jason and I had just agreed to work on this book together, and he was like, he's like, well, why don't we set this in the Boston area, because at least it'll feel more familiar to you. And our first thought was to set it in Malden, I think, as I mentioned to some folks earlier. And then we shifted it because we didn't want to set it somewhere very specific, and we ended up, but anyway, so that all was connected to that picture, which is amazing. It's really, I'm off my game, my usual game, because I'm kind of like I'm stumbling here. I'm like, I'm in the spot.
So did you write it in Italy?
So I wrote it in Italy, and we conversed over Skype. So when I was answering your question about how we talked about the book, we did it all over Skype. Except for one meeting, I had to come back to do the Boston Book Festival for my first book, The Gospel of Winter. And so that was in October. And so Jason and I met in New York, and we did a little bit of mapping of some things in the book. And then what's really, really wild about this is that I was working on another novel that I had under contract. He was working on two other novels that he had under contract. So we didn't start working on the book until December of 2014. And we finished our third draft of the book in March of 2015. And we turned the book in. It's a long story, but the point is that we went through 5 rounds of edits with an editor, and then 5 rounds of edits with a copy editor. So those 10 rounds of edits, and we were done by July 31st. We turned in the last draft. And then the book was on shelves the beginning of September. Which never happens. So credit where credit is due. Simon & Schuster also said, we have something here, back to the point about trying to create the conversations, we have something here that we shouldn't wait on. So they spent the money, they did the push, they did the right thing, for sure. Yeah.
Is there going to be a movie based on the book?
Oh, do you know a producer? No, we had one bit of interest, which was super exciting, but it fell through. The lawyers all had problems with each other, and it fell through. Then we had another bit of interest, but they really wanted to totally cut us out. And so we just couldn't do it. And we haven't had other interest, which really surprises me. I have to say, obviously I would love a movie or a Netflix show, which I think would be awesome.
Yeah.
Imagine every episode is a day, just like the book, and you get, it goes back and forth all day long. I don't know. And very truthfully, because I feel like I'm back home, so it's like being in the confession box. But the other issue is that Jason has some other work that's going into development. His book, Long Way Down, was picked up by John Legend, which is awesome. And his track series, his middle grade track series, was picked up for TV. So he has a lot of other stuff going on right now. So it's unlikely that they'll come back around to this soon, but maybe. I hope. I wish. I think it'd be a great Netflix show.
I agree.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
In the future, do you think you'll work with Jason again?
Great question. That's a great question. So again, if Jason were here, I know his answer would be, never, I hate this guy. And then he would say, but no. Because we're not sure. And here's why. We would love to work together again. It was a lot of fun. We both talk about this project as still the most meaningful project that either one of us has worked on because we got to work on it together. And it's really fun. He and I, so the 2 years after this book came out, he and I traveled together more than 100 days a year together. So that's 200 days in 2 years. Like my wife was like, dude, come home. And she's right. But we spend an enormous amount of time together. And we would love to do more together. But the question is, what? Because if we do, what's that? A sequel? No. So this is the yeah. Why not? Right? What do you think? What's the matter with sequels?
I don't know. They always like ruin the original.
They always ruin the original. We're terrified. We're terrified that we'll ruin something that we thought was okay by doing a sequel. And so the question is, well, what project then, right? And part of this is that it was like so organic. It came together because we literally cried together before we wrote this book together. And we were like pounding, we're old enough. We were pounding bar tops. You know, we were mad. And I was mad that I had one kind of anger and he had a very different kind of anger. And our angers were kind of angry that we couldn't be angry in the same way together. and so the question is maybe. The answer, rather, is maybe. And the other part of it is we wrote the whole book in secret. We didn't tell our agents. We didn't tell the publishing company that we both publish with. I told my wife, and that's the only person I told that I was working on it. And so if we were going to work on something again, we'd have to do it in secret. But truthfully, here's my question for you. If we were to do another project and it wasn't a sequel, what's something else that you think you'd like to see? What's another kind of story that you would like to see that might have a similar structure but would maybe be different? Yeah.
I mean, just like as an idea, like what you did, like in the story, like where people don't like see something but they don't say anything. So like maybe you can like take that into a different form, like with bullying maybe or something. I
think that's an awesome idea. With bullying?
Yeah, or just like different topics in general that tackles like society, like how you did with this book.
Yeah, I agree. That sounds good. What else? I'm collecting ideas. No. I won't steal your idea. Don't worry.
I was like gonna piggyback what he was saying, not just like bullying, just like two different lives of like instead of having it being boys, you can have like a Muslim girl with like a hijab on, and how that compares to like an average like American girl that doesn't have a hijab on, and how their lives are like different, but they live in the same like neighborhood and like go to the same school.
That's awesome.
I watched a movie about that.
Did you?
Amazed
Yeah, it's
at
like-
All American Girls.
Yeah. Yes. But wait, first, what's your point? And I'll respond to that. But yeah.
Okay, so I watched a movie that's like kind of similar to that. It was a Muslim girl and a Jewish girl, and like based in New York. They're both teachers, and like it like follows how like they're both like very similar but like so like different.
Wow, I haven't seen that. I can't believe I haven't
It was
seen
on
it.
Netflix, but then they removed it.
They removed it?
Netflix.
What?
I
Oh man, my paranoia is really at work right now. It's like, Big Brother is watching.
Better investigate.
His last name is 5 letters I don't want to say. That's really bad. It's not there because I would love to see that. That
I mean,
sounds
because it was like low
great.
production and stuff, so.
Oh,
So it was just a terrible movie.
like those indie
I mean, no,
movies.
it was good, like the story behind it,
Yeah.
but like,
Well, so actually, and this goes to your point too. There was a movie that a documentary that I was actually a part of. I was one of the teachers who was involved, and it's called "I'm Not a Racist, Am I?" And it follows students in New York City who have various racial backgrounds, and they're learning about each other's lives and trying to talk about it, and failing and getting into real fights and whatnot. It's a little similar, and that movie is still available, but it's not. It doesn't sound as good as the one you were talking about. But back to the sort of joint comment and what you were talking about before. Two things about that. One, whenever somebody asks the two of us, like, what do we regret or what will we change in All American Boys? Our number one answer is that we wrote this book too quickly, and in hindsight, we shamefully don't address enough of the women in the book. That's a failure on our part, for sure. And if we were on a radio interview one time, and the interviewer was asking us about Tiffany and Jill, and we were like, yeah, that would be an awesome book to learn more about that. And if we could go back and rewrite the book, we would write many more scenes with Tiffany and Jill, and especially because they're doing so much of the organizing in the school, which we knew in our minds, because as we always say, it's part of our shame is that we erase the work that women do all the time. And young women in particular, and young women of color in particular, are in some ways the backbone of civil rights movements all over the place in our country. And so for us to have done the same thing in our book is shameful on our part. And we, in our minds though, there they were. They're the students who are doing this great organizing in the school. We don't go show those scenes. It's all happening off camera, so to speak. So it would be awesome to do something like that. But wouldn't it be awesome if you wrote that book? I think it'd be great. It'd be amazing if you wanted to work on that book. That's something that I think is exciting about this too, is that, and this goes back to your point too about the kinds of different stories that would be relevant to maybe your own community. It'd be amazing if people in the community wrote responses. Like, it doesn't even have to be a whole novel. It could be a series of short stories where people partner up and write about multiple experiences in the community in some way. So that folks who, again, to your other point about kind of like waking folks up in some ways, some people who might not want to think about how different their neighbors' experiences are, might be forced to think about that when they see it through like a first-person story, side by side with somebody else like that. That would be powerful. I just got goosebumps thinking about that. That would be like not Malden Reads, Malden Writes. That would be amazing. That would be so cool.
We've been working on it.
And think about how young folks all across the country are leading us in so many ways. I mean, look at the leadership of Emma Gonzalez, who's like asking this nation to address gun control in a way that it hasn't before. And look at the number of students in Chicago who are saying, if we're going to talk about gun control, let's also talk about how that's important to the Black Lives Matter movement. Like, that's powerful stuff. And these are people who are like 18 years old. You can do it.
So I will say, is to add on to that, for Malden Reads, we had a mini writer's den this year. We had middle schoolers participate, and we're going to be putting together a publication with their work. But if any of your teachers can collect some of your writing, we'll make sure we also
We could
help to
include
publish
it in that,
Yeah.
like a second chapter, because there is the writer's den here at the high school, and they've done some phenomenal work, and they published a booklet last year. So this way we could obviously give the support and put it together.
I think that's fantastic.
Great idea.
That's really cool. I had a second piece to address, but I forgot it. Oh well, I'll come back to it. I got all excited about that other thing, and I lost my mind. But what else? Any other questions? Fair enough. Yeah.
Was it your first book writing like not a conversation but like two people, like perspectives of two people?
Yes, it was. That's a great question. Both in terms of the collaborating, like working with somebody else. It was the first time I had done that in this sense. I had when I was in college, I meant
like in the book, like how it's like two perspectives. Like,
yeah.
Was it your first idea to do it like that, or did you want to do it like one person?
Well, no. I understood your question, and I'll get to that too, because it's a great question, because I want to frame it this way. That it was the first time that I had thought about doing the dual narration, but for this particular story, it felt to me essential that we wrote it in a sense of own voices. That each person could write out of his own cultural context and be as authentic as possible and not mess it up. But I'm a big fan of books that have dual perspectives, and sometimes those books might be in third person, but I like the ones where you have multiple first person narration in some way. And in my book that just came out last week, Tradition, it's dual narration. one girl and one boy. And in order for me to do the work of writing the first person narration in the girl's shoes, I had to do an enormous amount of research, and more to the point, an enormous amount of listening. And there are 9 women who sort of read over my shoulder while I was working on the book. And for those who may have missed, it's similar in that it's using dual narration to present realities side by side, and the ways that boys get away with jokes and they don't recognize and not just jokes, it's jokes that set up an environment in which girls might feel threatened, and the guys don't recognize how much fear and threat and violence they're imposing on the young women. And it's about a young woman who's had enough of it. But this was the first time I sat down to do that, because I had been so used to writing in like a single narration or even in third person. All of the short stories that I've published, all except for one. Most of the short stories I've published are in third person, and then my first novel and this other short story was one person. So this was the first time that I realized, and then it got me thinking about how I could do that more often. And though this was my second book published, the second book that I wrote is called The Last True Love Story, and that was the book I was writing while waiting to get to this. And if I could go back and rewrite that book, I would write it from multiple perspectives. That is an awesome question that almost nobody ever asks. This is like the brilliant crowd. This is awesome. This is really exciting. What else? Yeah.
Well, like different types of genres, as you said, you wrote different types of genres. So
yeah.
Have you what's your most interested genre?
So I like writing stories that are realistic fiction. More of the stories that I read, the novels I read, the stuff I read is realistic fiction, because I think realistic fiction's role in some level is to get us to map the emotions inside a character, and how those emotions and that interior life responds to the confusion of reality. Because I find the stuff that I'm talking about in All American Boys, the misogyny and the institutional misogyny in Tradition, or in my first book, The Gospel of Winter, the cover-up for the scandal of abuse in the Catholic Church, and in The Last True Love Story, the ways in which we unfortunately frame family as one kind of definition, like there's an average family. No, there isn't. There's no such thing, in fact. And so I'm always trying to address a sort of social question from the emotions of the heart. my friends who write more like fantasy and sci-fi, they're often more interested in plot, and that's awesome. I just can't. I'm not as good at that. I wish. I just can't like figure that out. And but I'm working on a couple of projects right now that are a little bit of a divergence from what I've been doing before. Because Jason and I always tease each other. We're always like, well, how do we up our game? And so I'm trying to tackle something that's different. So there's some magical stuff. But mostly it's realism. I like contemporary realism. Yeah.
When did you know you wanted to be a writer? Like, what inspired you to be a writer?
Yeah. When did I know that I wanted to be a writer? So, this embarrassing anecdote I'll share with you. When I was in 8th grade, a couple friends of mine and I were like, this is a great idea, guys. Let's start a rap group. Yes. Oh my gosh, yes. It was a terrible idea. A terrible idea for so many reasons. I can't even get into it. We were bad. We thought we were the coolest thing on earth, though, of course. We were bad. But what was awesome about it was that we had to sit down and write lyrics. And as I was writing these lyrics, and then, when I got up to do my rap, that wasn't so hot. But when I was writing the lyrics, I realized, oh my God, of course I'm doing this because I love listening to rap music, and it's poetry. And it got me realizing that maybe I didn't have to do some of the stuff that I was doing, maybe I didn't have to mimic some of the people that I was listening to, but instead I could write my own lyrics that were really my own poems, and I began to write poetry when I was in middle school. I wrote poetry all through high school. And the reason why I wrote poetry was because I felt so much pressure to be a star athlete. We were a really good team. I went to St. John's Prep for high school up in Danvers, and for a whole variety of reasons. But I got shipped up there because I was messing up at Melrose Middle School. But I had lots of pressure for basketball. I felt a ton of pressure at school to do a good job in school. There was a lot of pressure at home for a variety of reasons. And so poetry became a way for me to sort of deal with, it's actually kind of like my answer for your question, to deal with my own emotions and to how do I map my emotions in relation to the chaos of the world around me. And for me, it was I had to present myself as public Brendan all over the place. But writing was a way for me to get to know the me on the inside that no one else knew. And I could ask questions to myself and begin to think about how I felt about my life and the world around me, and I could do it through poetry. That carried me through high school, and I didn't share a lot of it with everybody, but I wrote it. I shared it with a couple of friends I trusted. And it wasn't until after that I was in college and I started doing some more writing, and much to my surprise, I couldn't make Division I basketball teams. I don't know why. I couldn't make it. But I couldn't do the sports that I had been doing in high school. And I started doing more and more writing. And then this is also the piece of the truth that I don't often share with people. But I really knew I wanted to make writing the center of my life after I had moved to New York City, and I was in downtown Manhattan on 9/11. And I was there, and I have a whole story about that, but when I got home to my apartment in Brooklyn, and I took off my clothes that were covered in dust and everything else, I sat down and I wrote an 11-page letter to my family. My family had spread out all across the country. And I realized that it's not just me journaling. This is how I deal with the world. I write about it. And it took me, from that point on, it took me 10 years after that before I had a finished draft of The Gospel of Winter, my first novel. So it's a long process. It's a longer answer maybe than you were looking for. But it's all connected, right? Because if I'm processing the world now in my books, that processing began when I was your age, which is pretty amazing to think about. And now I get to live my dream because I've presented, my novels have been translated, weirdly or not this one. This one's only been translated in Germany. I feel like it's the movie thing. It's like, but many of my other books have been translated into other languages. So I've presented books in Italy and in Spain and Poland and the Czech Republic and Germany. I'm working on my invite to Brazil, because I really want to go to Brazil. It's pretty spectacular that I get to do that, and it began with my writing rap lyrics. It's pretty cool. You gotta start somewhere, yeah. And it was poetry. It's the same place that Jason started. Jason started writing by, his favorite artist was Queen Latifah. And he just basically read the liner notes and copied her lyrics as poems. And he made his way, he sort of made his mark on the Washington, D.C. poetry slam scene. That's where he got started. And he started as a teenager. And he did that by literally copying Queen Latifah's lyrics. And then now he's getting his honorary doctorate degree at Lesley. And he's doing a whole lecture on connecting Queen Latifah's lyrics to Shakespeare, to somebody else, I forget, but it's amazing. It's so stunning. He's a genius. But good place to start. All right.
So, can we wrap up with hearing you rap?
That is hilarious. No way. That's amazing. That's amazing. No, I cannot. I can recite W.B. Yeats. No, just kidding.
Well, in lieu of that, I think some of us have to go back to class and stuff. So
Yeah.
we can,
Of course. Oh,
thank
school.
you and
Although, good news, guys.
see you
Thank you so
tonight.
much.
Thank